stuff with Zoom, but you're all very welcome, and thank you for coming on for this, the second of our Friends of the Wellington Trust Heritage Lectures. I will tell you more about our speaker in a minute, but in the meantime, I will say that we've had an incredible response to this with, I believe, 230 people actually registering to interest in the lecture. Not everyone, of course, will be here necessarily, but that is a fantastic support, and we're most grateful for those who have registered to come on to what I can promise you is going to be an absolutely fascinating lecture from Dr. Paul Stott. Just as a matter of interest, before I get on to the technical bits, I would just say that quickly give you a flavor of those who have actually, or those bodies who are represented who are have registered for the lecture. And that includes, apart from the Friends of the Wellington Trust, that includes the Friends of the National Museum of the Royal Navy, welcome, the Company of Shipwrights, and I will give a special mention, if I may, to the clerk, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole Mackintosh, without which, as they say in film premiere circles, nothing would have been possible. It is another measure of the fantastic cooperation that Shipwrights showed towards us, the Honourable Company, and also the Maritime, the Wellington Trust, that we are able to actually share what is in fact the annual lecture for the Worshipful Company of Shipwrights. This is what is being given here on our Wellington site tonight. So thank you so much, Colonel Cole Mackintosh. We also have many members from the Honourable Company of Master Mariners. I'll go through quickly the others. We have representatives from the Cachalots, the Anchorites, the Royal Institute of Navigation and the Society for Nautical Research, the Army Navy Club, the Naval Club, Worshipful Company of Watermen and Lightermen. Hi, Eric. I better mention actually the RAF Club as well, because there's one member from the RAF Club. The Association of Royal Naval Officers, which is ARNO, a wonderful organization. Association of Dunkirk Little Ships, bravo. The Barbers Company, reminds me I should have had a haircut tonight. City Naval Club, the Clyde Built Association, Defence UK, the Institute of Marine Engineers and the Society of Maritime Industries, Defence Synergia, I hope I pronounced that correctly, and I'm very sorry that I'm so sorry, I've lost his name, has had problem coming on from that organization. The Institute of Civil Engineers, the National Maritime Association, looks after supporting UK SMEs in the maritime sector. Nautilus International, Newcastle University, bravo. I know there's at least one student come to hear the boss. Ocean Liner Society, the Royal Institution of Naval Architects, very appropriate. The Seven Seas Club, hi chaps. The International Association of Maritime and Shipping Professionals, the Naval Dockyard Society, the Ward of Cheap Club, my much beloved ward club back in the city, and last by no means least, the White Ensign Association. And if I've missed anybody, and I think it's highly likely, I do apologize. Great to have you all here, or at least registered. This evening's talk is a massive subject, and it's one which I'm personally looking forward to enormously. The lecture will probably go on for about an hour and 5 minutes, but I would recommend that if you can, do stay with it, even if you're going out to grab a glass of wine, because it is a large subject, but quite fascinating. Now, some housekeeping notes before I finally introduce our speaker. Your microphone has been muted. Would you please keep it on muted? We are, and also most of you, I think, if not all of you, have your videos turned off. And I think as far as you can, would you keep those off during the lecture as well? Because as you know, it does play slight havoc with bandwidth for reasons I can't begin to understand. If you would like to pose a question, there is the chat icon for those who are not so familiar with Zoom on what should be your bottom bar. Mine's around about the middle there. And if you click on that chat icon, it'll bring up a box, which it does, which is about 3 inches square on mine. And as long as you have it addressed to everyone, and there's a drop-down arrow by everyone, which means you can talk to anybody else if you can find them, but leave it on everyone and just put your question in there. Fiona Sparks, who is our trust manager, will be collecting those and monitoring them as we go through. And there certainly will be time for maybe 3, maybe 4 questions, possibly at the end. What Dr. Paul has suggested, or at least I've suggested, and he's very kindly agreed, a slight arm twist, is that if there are any particularly pertinent or cogent questions that he would like to respond to after the event, we will be giving him a list of all those chats, so they will not be lost.
I resign!
Hello. Rodney. Hello. Good evening. Jenny, please, if you would.
Sure.
We will actually let Paul have those questions, and he will be in a position, I think, hopefully, to be able to make 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 written answers, which we will circulate to all those who are on. Anyway, that is where it is. Now, if you want to close your chat box, in the top right-hand corner on the green bar, hopefully there is a little cross. So you just click there and it comes down off again. For those who have got a right-hand side, if you have that, I think if you click twice on your chat icon, that should also close it. As I've said, there will be a recording of this lecture, and we will send you the link after the event over the next few days. And you will be able to access that for quite some considerable time, I think, as well. Now, with no more ado, because you've heard me too much, I am very grateful. We are all, at the Friends of the Wellington Trust, grateful for Dr. Paul Stott to give his time this evening. Paul originates from Liverpool. He is a lecturer at the Newcastle University Department of Engineering, their marine technology group, which is within the School of Engineering. He is from Liverpool, so he had a good start in life as far as the sea was concerned. And while his first ambition was to be a seafarer, and he joined the British Merchant Navy as an apprentice at the age of 16, after a little while, and having been appointed a cadet, he decided it wasn't for him. So he came ashore and returned to education, but still very determined, thank God for tonight, to follow his interests in shipping. He undertook a university degree, and he got a first-class degree in naval architecture back in 1984. And he spent the next 26 years working industry before coming an academic back at Newcastle in 2010. His industrial career over that quarter of a century was spent mainly in shipbuilding, initially as a shipyard project manager, then as a consultant advising on strategic planning for shipyard development and competitiveness throughout the world. In fact, he has worked in over 40 countries as a consultant doing this, and his work includes producing the strategic plan for China's largest shipyard, stand by Paul, at Waigaoqiao. Is that all right? Marks out of 10. Good. I'll take it as 1. And he has also represented the European Union as a technical expert at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which is going to become a fairly important part of our lives very shortly, I believe. He became an academic partly to research solutions to long-standing strategic problems in global shipping, and he was awarded a PhD in 2017. The result of that work has been central to his role recently advising the OECD and the government of Japan on shipbuilding issues, all very hot and relevant stuff. He is a freeman of the City of London, and he was about a year or so ago invited to join the Worshipful Company of Shipwrights, for which company he is a mentor at Newcastle University. Just finally to round off, outside the world of shipping, in his free time, he is a musician, being a pianist and church organist, and very accomplished, so I understand, and a gardener. And he loves to walk, he says, in his beautiful Northumbrian countryside surrounding his home, which I believe, you don't mind saying, Paul, is not far from Morpeth. May I now hand over to Dr. Paul Stott with great pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alistair, and good evening, everyone. I'm hoping, could you just give me a thumbs up that you're hearing me, Alistair? Excellent. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by just saying how honoured I am by my own company, the Shipwrights, to be asked to do the annual lecture, and also by the Wellington Trust. So I thank you for that. As an academic, one is always grateful for any platform for giving one's views, but such an august body as this, well, I'm grateful, thank you. But I'm very sorry I'm not aboard Wellington. The time will come, hopefully. For many reasons, actually, but including one that's relevant to what I'm talking about tonight. And I've been on board Wellington once, and when I got into what I might call the lobby, I was taken aback because there was a model there of a ship that I recognised. The ship is the Torrens. Beautiful, beautiful model. And for anyone who doesn't know, the Torrens was a three-masted clipper ship. It was minorly famous for having the record for the London to Adelaide route under sail, so the fastest clipper ship on that route. But it was mostly famous for Joseph Conrad spent 2 years as the ship's mate before he left the sea to be an author. And I looked at this model and I was amazed because way back at the start of my career, in the 1980s, I worked at a shipyard in Sunderland called Sir James Lang's. Well, actually, it was called the Deptford Shipyard of Sunderland Shipbuilders when I worked there. But it was the yard that in 1875 built the Torrens. And as a fresh graduate from Newcastle in my collar and tie in the shipyard, I was in the lobby looking at an identical model to that that's on Wellington of the Torrens. And I was approached by the yard manager. There is a point to this story, I will get there. John Barker, wonderful man, sadly no longer with us. Very scary, one removed from the bowler-hatted shipbuilding managers of old. And he engaged me in conversation. I asked him what the Torrens was, and he said, "You've never heard of the Torrens? You'll tell me next you've never heard of Joseph Conrad." And he got me reading Conrad, for which I was grateful. But he told me the story that in the 1960s, that shipyard was bought by a company called Courtline. And one of the first things that Courtline did was round up all the shipyard's models and send them off to auction houses in London to liquidate them as cash. And John Barker said to me, there was no way these, and I can't use the word he used in polite company, so he said to me there was no way that these gentlemen were going to get the Torrens. And he hid the model of the Torrens in the woodshed. And when Courtline went bust, he went and removed the Torrens and put it back on show in the shipyard. And that speaks to what I'm talking about tonight, which is the pride that we have still. I mean, that was a ship that was built in 1875. We are still proud of it. As we are, I'm pushing my button and unfortunately I'm not.
Jenny, can you?
Okay, it's working now. We still do this today. We are very proud of our ships. So when I'm asking this question, whatever happened to the shipbuilding industry? Hang on, who said it's disappeared? It's still very much alive, and it's building things like this, ships of which we are inordinately proud. We can see there Astute, the Carriers, and the David Attenborough Cameleers. These are ships that the people who buy them are extremely proud of, and there is no doubt they are world-class, first-rate ships of the highest order. So what am I talking about? Whatever happened to our shipbuilding industry? Because it's alive. I wish I could say it was alive and well. It is alive and doing its best to be well. So what am I talking about with my question? Well, this photograph tells you what I'm talking about. That's Cameleerd's fitting out basin in its heyday. I'm talking about shipbuilding in what I will define what this heyday is in a moment. And it's an industry that we now look back on very fondly with a great deal of nostalgia. So I'm going to go right in at the start and ask the question, when was this heyday? And to answer that, I'm going to put up this graph, which shows market shares of the global dominators of shipbuilding back to 1892. And on the vertical axis is the proportion of the world's shipbuilding markets that each of these dominators had. and we are the blue line. So we can see that in 1892, we, the UK, had 82% of the global shipbuilding market. That was our heyday. We can then see what I'm going to come back to a lot. That line then basically progressed downhill throughout the entire 20th century to be overtaken in the 1950s by the black line, which is Japan, who became dominator after us, followed by the red line, which is South Korea, and then followed by the green line, which is China. And there's currently a battle going on between the black, the red, and the green lines at the moment as to what's happening at the top of the shipbuilding industry. But notice that no one ever got anywhere near our 82%, and no one held on to the lead for as long as we did. So that was our heyday. Well, we peaked. Our zenith was back in 1892. And then we had basically a century of declining share, at least. And when I first did this presentation, I was aware that I was giving it to a room full of people, myself included, who'd been managers in this business. And was it our fault? What did we do to lose the shipbuilding industry? And I'm happy to say I don't feel guilty. And there was some absolution in this presentation for those present. That, well, you'll see my story. Whatever we did, I don't think we were going to save it. But we have to ask the question, if we'd done things differently, would we have kept that 82%? Was it something we did do? Was it something we didn't do? I'm talking now as someone who's a manager in that industry. If we'd made different decisions, would we have saved our world dominance? And is this guilt right? Should we collectively feel guilty in some way about losing this once great industry? Well, I'm going to talk about those this evening. Now, anyone you talk to about the demise of shipbuilding will give you their reason as to why shipbuilding disappeared. And the commonly held views include, I put up this graph of what was called the British disease back in the 1970s, our terrible strike record. So some people will tell you we lost it because of poor industrial relations and a bad strike record. Others will tell you it was poor management. And there is our wonderful archetypal old shipyard manager with his bowler hat on, rather uselessly pointing at a piece of wood for the photograph. Was it bad industrial relations? Was it poor management? Other people will tell you it was political, lack of government support. And I, as I'm sure many listening, are old enough to recognise Tony Benn there and Jimmy Earley from the Upper Clyde shipbuilders disputes of the 1970s. Was it because the government didn't support us? This is an interesting one. We lost the industry because of the grammar school system. And it's a good theory. The theory goes that grammar schools creamed off the best brains, and you didn't go to grammar school to work in the shipyards. That was your escape. Particularly in the mines, that was your escape. That the grammar schools were designed to send people out into the classical professions. So you went out to be a teacher or a lawyer or a doctor. Anything but go back into the shipyards or the mines. So the grammar school, the theory goes, creamed off our best brains and made sure they didn't come into our industry. Other people would tell you it was privatization was the problem. Now, I have to be contentious at this point, and when I have given this presentation in my part of the world, the northeast of England, all I need to do is put up this photograph. Many people would tell you that the lady's fingers are pointing in the wrong direction there to how she felt. And a lot of people around here would tell you there is one reason we lost our industry because Margaret Thatcher closed it. And I have to very gently tell people, I'm afraid that wasn't the cause. The attribution of the death of the industry to Margaret Thatcher just does not stand up to scrutiny. Let me show you what I mean. So this is output from UK shipbuilding. I mean, I'm really blessed in Newcastle University. We have a special collection which I have the records of the UK shipbuilding industry back to the mid-19th century. So I can produce data like this, which is very valuable. This is our output in 1,000 tons. And you can see that we trucked along at somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million gross tons. Very, very, very volatile, which I'll come back to in a moment. Up until just after the 1973 oil crisis, when you can see up to 1980, that final slide. Margaret Thatcher came to power then, when that final slide was already halfway through. How could it have been her fault? I put up this graph as well, because we sort of tend to think that we in the UK lost our industry and everyone else has this rosy garden that they're still living in, building ships. It's not true. This is output from the total European commercial shipbuilding industry from 1975. And we can see that output fell from 20 million tons produced per year in 1975 down to, by the time we got to the 80s, less than 5 million. And we're probably, well, cruise shipping is helping a lot actually in 2 countries, but a lot lower than that now. So Margaret Thatcher came to power then. How can we blame her for the closure of the industry in Sweden, most of the industry in Spain, most of the industry in France, a lot of the industry in Germany, and so on? It just doesn't stack up. So I've lost my contact with the presentation again. Oh, all of these things, these are symptoms, these aren't causes, and I'll come back to them later. But these were symptoms of overwhelming changes. So if these aren't the causes, then what actually did happen? What were the root causes? And I've got 4 of them to give us tonight. Before I get there, I'm looking at my watch, Alistair, so I'll try and keep to the hour, but I need to digress a little bit, because to set the scene, I've got to ask 2 key and very interesting questions.
Feel free.
No, thank you. Number 1, how on earth did we come to have 82% in the first place? We can learn a lot by asking that question. And number 2, why do we look back on shipbuilding and coal mining and steelworking, which, for reasons that I will show you in a moment, it makes no sense. We look back at them through rose-colored spectacles in a very positive light. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about that, and there are things we can learn from answering that question. So why did we have 82% is my first question. And there are 3 causes to that. We had an empire that we had to serve, and it was disparate around the globe with our maps that used to be partially coloured in that rosy pink colour. We needed ships to serve that empire. Secondly, we were running short of wood. If we were having a meeting like this 150 years ago, we'd been talking about how on earth are we going to build ships because we're running out of trees. And thirdly, we had some sort of supremacy in the Industrial Revolution that came to our aid. So first of those, how do we get 82% of the market? Well, we own 60% of the ships. My computer's not.
Jenny, can you move it forward?
Behaving. I know, backwards. I'm trying to.
All right.
Trying to go backwards. Well, I'll have to talk about that slide without seeing it. So we had 60% of the ships. We had a mighty empire that required 1 merchant ships to carry the trade and 2 warships, defense ships, maybe I should call them, to protect those trades. So we had a huge demand for ships because of our empire dotted around the globe. The second problem was our shortage of wood, and that threatened, if we couldn't build the ships, our empire economically wouldn't work. So we had a problem, and it takes a lot of trees to build a ship. It took roughly 6,000 mature oaks on 30 to 50 acres of land to build 1 Royal Navy sailing vessel. We persisted on building our ships higher quality out of hardwood, as opposed to, for example, the United States, where softwood is adopted. But a softwood ship would be lucky to last 10 years. There we go. Hopefully you can control this. So we had a problem. There was a commission that in the 1860s calculated that we needed 400,000 acres of timber per year to build the annual British output of merchant and naval ships. So we had a real problem. Happily, the Industrial Revolution, which we were fairly supreme for a while at, came to our rescue because we developed the technology to forget wood and build larger ships out of iron and then steel, and we invented and produced steam propulsion. So what was a problem with the shortage of wood? We came up with an opportunity because of our technical supremacy in those. So how do we achieve 82%? Well, we had the economic necessity of the empire, we had a technological lead, and it's also true to say prior to World War II, the British government was highly supportive of shipbuilding. We had a lot of government support because of its value to the economy and the empire. So these days we are used to us in the UK complaining about other people being subsidised. This is a quote from the American Economic Association in 1905, who were complaining about the level of subsidies we had in the UK. The advocates of government aid to shipping refer to Great Britain as the foremost example of a subsidy-giving power and ascribe the supremacy of the British merchant fleet to the policy of giving liberal subsidies to steamship companies. So, I mean, the subsidies, for example, mail subsidies given to the shipping companies. But in the modern era, because those ships were built in British shipyards, they would have been construed as shipbuilding subsidies, indirect shipbuilding subsidies. So we were strongly supported by the government. We would eventually lose all of these factors, the economic necessity and our technological lead and our government support. So that sets the scene in one sense. Second scene setting, why do we look back with such rose-coloured spectacles? Now, this is my favourite image of shipbuilding. This is one of Stanley Spencer's paintings. Stanley Spencer, more famous for his religious subjects in his village of Cookham in Berkshire, was a war artist in the Clyde shipyards in World War II, and he produced these absolutely massive and beautiful paintings that are now in the Imperial War Museum. And they're a bit odd because everyone's dressed in tweeds, everyone's got a nice soft bonnet on, as they call them on the Clyde. There's a nice rosy glow everywhere, and it's a view of shipbuilding that I recognise, and well, there is my attempt at rose-tinted spectacles that we view the industry through. We look back at it with a lot of nostalgia. I'm really struggling to change.
I'm sorry about this.
Slides now.
Jenny, can you move on ahead?
Now, why this is so odd was because, why this looking back with it with rose-tinted spectacles, because shipbuilding then, even more than now, was difficult. It was hard. The Japanese have 3 words for shipbuilding, and it's industries of a similar type: Kitani, Kaiken, and Kitsui, which translate to 3 Ds in English as dirty, dangerous, and demeaning. The British Film Institute has fabulous footage of Olympic being built at Harland and Wolff in Belfast in 1911. And I use that footage now to teach third-year students about health and safety, because the problems, falling from height, tripping hazards and so on, are the same now as they were then. But if you look back at the working practices a century ago, they're just glaringly obvious how dangerous this world was. Could you move on, please, Jenny? We've got gremlins.
Sorry about that.
Okay, so the industry, I've got it sussed now, I hope. The industry was dangerous, but it had another problem. There was no job security in the industry, and this was a real issue. How dangerous was it? Well, it's understudied, but we have some data because everything about Titanic is studied to death. So we know that during the building of the Olympic class liners, we have some data. So during the construction of Titanic, 8 shipyard workers died. 1 ship, 8 shipyard workers died. There were 28 severe injuries. That means loss of a limb or some other injury that is probably going to put you out of work. And there were 200 slight accidents that required medical attention. So it's not widely known that we killed 8 people during the building of the ship itself. It wasn't just Titanic. If we take the first 2 in the series together, Olympic and Titanic, we can double that roughly. There were 17 fatalities and 450 accidents. Now, hey, I'm an academic, so it's a huge extrapolation to draw any conclusions from those 2 data points. But no, it was working and it's now. What I can say is that it was not unheard of to kill around 8 persons per ship and to maim about 30 others. And that's not to mention the chronic debilitating industrial diseases, mesothelioma, deafness, repetitive strain, and others. So it was a dangerous place to work and a difficult place to work, and you had no job, no security of employment. Without social security, prior to the introduction of the welfare state, these accidents could be personally catastrophic. Your family would go hungry. And even without that, you had no security of employment. So let's go back to this graph that shows the level of volatility prior to World War II. World War II is the gap in the middle of this time series, by the way, where data is uncertain. If we just look at the left-hand side, look at how much shipbuilding demand goes up and down. Shipbuilding then as now, and it remains the greatest problem we have as shipbuilders, is the demand is volatile. It goes up and down. And before World War II, it was seriously volatile. How do you cope with that volatility? Because as an investor, that's risk. How can you predict your revenue in a market that is so uncertain as that? how can business cope with such volatility? Well, business partially coped in its heyday by minimizing the amount of investment, and the industry relied on investment being made by skilled artisanal labor, which constituted a significant part of that investment. So basically, there was some investment, of course, in the shipyards themselves, in the sheds and the cranes and the slipways and so on, but a huge part of the investment was made by the shipyard workers through their apprenticeship system, that there was a closed shop, and only if you'd done your 4 to 7 years apprenticeship were you allowed to work in a shipyard. So the workers in the industry themselves were making this significant investment in the apprenticeship, and they were rewarded. They had made the workforce carried the business. A lot of the business risk is the way I look at this, rather than the capital, and they were rewarded with what I would now call a 0-hour contract. They were rewarded by being given the mother and father, in fact, of all 0 hours contracts, and we are still living with the consequence of that in our labour relations today. So that's what the output looked like, and during these frequent downturns, your shipbuilding employer may say, I'm sorry, I don't need you this month, might not need you this year, might not need you next year either, and there was nothing you could do. There was no social security system to help you, so your family went hungry. And it's no surprise that big dip there, which is in the 1930s and the Great Depression, that's when we had this famous event. Oh, it moved on without me. I can't get back to it. Oh, there we go. The Jarrow March in 1936, when over 80% of Tyneside shipyard workers were unemployed and without means of earning a living, and their families were going hungry. So it was an extremely difficult industry to work in. So there's no surprise then that given these dangerous conditions and the difficult industry, we ended up with a mighty organisation to protect the interest of the investors who were the workforce, and it was called the Boilermakers Society. And two root causes here are going to come back to haunt us later on. Control of supply of labour through the apprenticeship system. You were only allowed to work in a shipyard if you had done your apprenticeship, you'd put your time in, and you were a boilermaker in one of the trades. And those trades were demarcated. And I have a brief list of the demarcations here. This is only a sample. Riveters, caulker burners, platers, shipwrights, drillers, blacksmiths, and so on. And a caulker burner could not do a plater's job, and a plater could not do a shipwright's job. So we instituted this very tightly controlled system of employment in the shipyards. So the industry developed to be dependent on the labour force. And the industry, therefore, the capital, had a vested interest in preserving the old shipbuilding strategy, riving and utilising those craft skills, which made it more difficult for the UK to modernise when the world changed during World War II. So given this type of industry, that it was dangerous and precarious work, why do we look back on it with nostalgia? Well, firstly, because we were internationally important with our shipbuilding industry. And the photograph I put up to support that is the 1929 Northeast Coast Exhibition, when the world came here to Newcastle to have a look at how we built ships and to think that we were to be emulated and copied. So it gave us international position. The main reason, I believe, though, is because in the workforce it generated very strong social structures, and it's those social structures that we miss rather than the dirty and dangerous industry. Strong social cohesion and strong communities developed out of large numbers of men engaged in joint enterprise and struggling against a common foe. And the common foe was not, as one might presume, shipyard owners and the capital. It was the job. It was everybody worked in the same conditions in this difficult, dangerous and demeaning job. And that generated a great deal of camaraderie. And it's these communities, I think, that we miss more than the shipyards themselves. So shipbuilding towns were booming. That's Glasgow in its heyday. That's one of the wonderful working men's clubs up here in Newcastle. We had this strong social infrastructure. We also had whole areas of town that were built right up to the shipyard gate. And this is going to, we can see in this photograph, I think this is John Brown's. The shipyard houses and communities are developed right up to the shipyard gate. And that's also going to come back to haunt us later on. So that's preamble. How did we get to, I mean, this is the very end of our heyday, I would say. That's the launch of QE2 in 1963, no, 5. And there's a photograph. If you take a photo of John Brown's today out the window, that's what it looks like. How did we get from these two? So what were the root causes? Well, an early scare came in 1925, and I put up this photograph. I'm sure I'm talking to an audience who recognize a number of things about this photograph. A number of you will be ship nerds like me and going, oh, look, it's a Furness Withy gold poster. Many others will recognize the name politician, which became famous. This is under Thomas Harrison's colors, became famous as the SS cabinet minister in the novel by Compton Mackenzie, Whiskey Galore, made into an Ealing comedy. Now, Politician was built in 1923 for one of our wonderful Empire shipping companies, Furness Withy, who not only had a shipping company, they had a shipyard. They had the Furness shipyard at Haverton Hill on Teesside. So they built their own ships, and this ship was originally called London Merchant. 2 years later, they built the Pacific Grove, and the unthinkable happened. Pacific Grove, from a company that had its own shipyard, was ordered for Furness Withy at Deutsche Werft AG of Kiel in Germany, a shipyard that was later to be Hufelswerke Deutsche Werft, HDW. Still an important shipyard, or until recently anyway. So hang on, what had happened? One of our Empire shipping companies who owned a shipyard had ordered a ship in Germany. And this started what I believe, and this is why I date, I was asked in 2019 to give a presentation to the Society of Maritime Industries on the subject of resurrection of the British shipbuilding industry. And I'm able to show with this slide that if you'd asked me a century ago, you'd have given me the same subject. 1925, a joint committee between the Shipbuilders Employees Federation and the shipyard trade unions, terms of reference to arrive at definite conclusions as to the best means which would be taken to re-establish the industry to enable it to retain its preeminent position in world shipbuilding. So we've been talking about re-establishing and resurrecting this industry now for the best part of 100 years. And this takes me to root cause number one. Basically what had happened is others had caught up with our technical lead by 1925 and actually started exceeding it in terms of their ship designs and their technology for building those ships. And others had developed their own strong home markets. We think of empire as being the British Empire, but there was a French Empire, a Dutch Empire, a Spanish Empire, an Italian Empire, a German Empire, and they built their own ships. So basically other industries in Europe caught up with us. And notably, whilst the UK persisted with dependence on craft skills, continental shipbuilders overtook us through investment in shipyards, shipbuilding technology, and ship design. And I am in no doubt that if the Second World War hadn't happened, Germany would have superseded us in that succession of industry dominators that I showed you earlier on before Japan did so. And particularly because Germany had started welding rather than riveting and made the investments required to do that. So that was the first thing that happened. Others caught up with us. The second thing that happened, and it's related to the Battle of the Atlantic and a disruptive technology that was developed in the United States to help us with that. So appropriately in this period of remembrance, we should remember that the Battle of the Atlantic cost 30,248 merchant seafarers their lives in World War II, 2,200 merchant ships sunk, 13 million tons. We needed to replace them very quickly, and we couldn't do it in the UK fast enough. So we looked to the United States, who helped us with the emergency shipyards that built 2,500 of these standard Liberty ships. The US applied the techniques of mass production to building ships. They built 2,500 Liberty ships and 533 standard T2 tankers between 1941 and 1945 to help us replace our tonnage. And still today, I teach my students that the record for building a ship was a Liberty ship. The Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes from keel lay to delivery. I would have no doubt at all that that record still stands. 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes to build a ship. Of course, it was a publicity stunt and they had all the parts lined up to do it. And there was a competition between the emergency shipyards to do it. But I still find it quite astonishing. And the way they were able to do that was because of mass production. And the only way to do that mass production in building ships was to stop riveting and to start welding. So the disruptive technology that came along in World War II was we started to weld ships. Welding is faster and easier than riveting, particularly when we've got a workforce that needs to be trained quickly because they're emergency shipyards, and include a large number of women for whom wielding sledgehammers was predicted to be difficult. But welding does something special for us as shipbuilders in terms of our build strategy. It allows prefabrication of blocks to be undertaken. And that was a radical shift in the way that we build ships. So welding was the key to move us on from that. Photograph is what one of our heyday shipyards looked like. Assembly at the final assembly point, piece by piece of a ship. And this is a photograph of Hyundai Heavy Industries today. 90% of the outfit is on that steel block. It's a beautiful thing, a beautiful steel block. The only way you can build ships in that way is through welding. You cannot rivet and do that. So the world moved on. Now, there were problems with early welding, not least the problems of cracking that we haven't got time to go into. And welding was strongly resisted here in the UK, including by the Admiralty. But by 1943, the Admiralty was forced to agree that welding was the way to go, even with the cracking problems that we had. And this is a quote from the Lords Commissioners in 1943. That policy, by which we mean the adoption of welding, has to a large extent been dictated by the same conditions which operated in America, namely the insufficiency of proficient labour and the necessity for the rapid training of dilutees, including women. Not my terminology to use dilutees. That's a pejorative term that came out of the First World War when they were women working in industry were called munitionettes and dilutees. But to get ships built, we had to start welding. And the United States, they put out these two now cultural icons. On the left there we have Wendy the welder, and on the right we have Rosie the riveter. So far from seeing it as a problem, it was made into a propaganda victory in the United States shipyards. And the world changed because of this. Far from being the problem we'd envisaged, the use of dilutees led to a step change that revolutionized what the industry could achieve. But we had our absolutely entrenched demarcated workforce and our Boilermakers Society controlled workforce. What were we going to do with the riveters, the holder-uppers, the heaters, the throwers, the catches? These are the people who make up a riveting squad when we don't need them anymore, and we've entrenched a system that doesn't work except with these trades. So in trying to get from there to there, friction was inevitable. So we spent the next 40 years trying to shoehorn the old demarcations and labour paradigms into the new world order. Was the problem that we had. The newly established industries, for example in Japan, the industry had been decimated. It had been bombed out of existence, and there was no world order. They were starting from scratch, and greater efficiency was inevitable. So root cause number one, others caught up. Root cause number two, production methods changed radically in World War II, and our labour paradigms were incompatible with the New World Order and were very difficult to change. Root cause number three is related to what is now known as Japan's post-war economic miracle. That was their build-up of market share in shipbuilding up to the 1990s. Shipbuilding was chosen as one of the industries to resurrect Japan's decimated economy following World War II. And it was developed using United States capital that piled in to build the shipyards. They sent across the technology that they developed in building Liberty ships and the expertise, and the size and shape of shipyards in the New World Order radically changed in a very short space of time. So the left-hand photograph here is the Doxford shipyard in Sunderland, a typical British riverside ribbon development of a shipyard hemmed in by its social housing. Right is what Mitsubishi Kawasaki, who was market leader in the mid-70s, looked like with their tanker factory. The shape and type of investment radically changed because of the technical changes to our shipbuilding strategy in World War II. And we in the UK had no appetite, but very little appetite for investment in what we'd need to do to come up with the new type of shipyard to build the new shipbuilding strategy. And for the most part, the industry tried to shoehorn the new technology into the old investment paradigm. Now, we could ask the question, if we'd invested properly, would we have saved our industry? And I have to say the answer is no, and I'll give you some examples as to why I say that. Even where in Europe the investment was made, it didn't compete. So here we have what in the 1980s I was given as the world's best shipyard. This is the Kockums shipyard in Malmo, which you can see has Goliath cranes, the very big gantry cranes over the dock. It has a large dock. It has big sheds for producing large outfitting blocks. So this is basically the Japanese style shipyard developed in Sweden. It was constructed in 1974 and it didn't last 10 years. It closed for commercial shipbuilding within 10 years. So even those who made the investment in Europe didn't manage to survive. The new yards in the Far East, Japan and then South Korea particularly, invested not only in the technology but also in scale in the pursuit of efficiency. And shipyards became extremely large because to compete for large commercial ships you have to have scale. And our riverside shipyard sites were too small, even if we had the appetite for investment. Now I can hear people shouting at the screen because we did make some investment I'll come to in a moment. But before I do that, have a look at how the world changed. So this is back to the graph that I first put up in terms of market share. But this time, this is tons of ships produced. So the black line is us back to 1892. And that black line is our 1 to 1.5 million tons per year. Look what happened after World War II. We saw a peak in the 1970s in Japan of getting up to 20 million tons per year produced, and then 40 million in the most recent peak. The volume in shipbuilding changed radically following World War II. So actually, we were the global dominator of an industry that ceased to exist after World War II when we were overtaken of others. So that's the industry that we look back on with our rose-tinted spectacles. It finished with World War II, basically. So in many cases, our shipyards were just too constrained. So here we've got Doxford's again with its little narrow river into which to launch. We've got a wide ribbon site along the river, great for the old shipbuilding strategy, but not for the new one. And we've got a site that most of them were that's hemmed in by workers' housing. So how are we going to expand that without knocking down areas of town and rehousing people? Now, okay, we did invest properly in some places, and I put here as one example Pallion. The Pallion shipyard in Sunderland, it's still there, was a great shipyard. We can see there its dock for building bulk carriers on the lower photograph. This replaced the Ribbon shipyard on the left. And those of us who worked there would say, yeah, it was a bit cramped, but it was, and I guess could still be, a fine investment and a good shipyard. So we did invest in some places. Here we've got an even better example. This is the Harland and Wolff dock. They even invested in Harland and Wolff in the right size of dry dock, a very large tanker dry dock with these huge Goliath cranes. But this is what we were competing against. This is Hyundai Heavy, competes with Daewoo Shipbuilding as the world's largest shipyard. Their biggest dock, number 3, is 672 meters long and 92 meters wide. And that is non-dimensionally what its profile looks like. That's what Pallion looks like compared to Hyundai's dock to scale. We can fit 6 of them in Hyundai's dock. But hey, we build small ships, so there were other things that Pallion could build. But if we're competing on market share, it was too small. We could fit 6 Pallions into one Hyundai dry dock. So back to Hyundai's dock profile. Hey, Harland & Wolff built the right size dock. It's the same size as Hyundai's biggest dock. So what went wrong there? Hyundai's got 9 of them. That's the scale that we're up against in trying to build large ships. So that level of investment to keep up was far beyond the risk horizon of any British investor, even if our sites had been big enough. So root cause number 1, others caught up. Root cause number 2, shipbuilding changed in World War II because of the introduction of welding, and we struggled to adapt to the new world order. Number 3, our capital investment was insufficient to cope with this, what I'm calling new world order. Root cause number 4, end of empire and globalization. And that had 2 effects. Number 1, ships became bigger, and number 2, that home market that supported us disappeared. Now this is a graph of total shipbuilding output back to 1892, and you can see it comes in waves, which is another lecture, what those waves are about. But also please notice it's exponential, and that since World War II, the exponential expansion of the output from the industry has been not constant, but the underlying trend absolutely is constant. And this is caused by we're moving more trade. Global seaborne trade exponentially increases by 2 to 3% per year, so we need more ships. But also we have developed much bigger ships to move that trade. So the product's changed. This is a ship that I'm rather fond of. I was a first trip apprentice on that, age 16, an awful long time ago. And this is typical of our output after World War II. Freighters, we called them, general cargo ships. And this one is about 14,000 deadweight. So that was typical of the sort of thing that we built. Now, I can't remember where I stole this illustration from, but representing ship size is difficult unless you've got pictures. So I've put a red arrow there about that size of ship. That's the typical size of ship that we built in the post-World War II era. That second one from the top. By the mid-70s, that Leviathan there, that SO Atlantic, that's the size that ships had got up to. I mean, that's a particularly big one. But ships became an order of magnitude bigger. This is an image that I like very much. This was produced by a professor of mine in the 1980s, Professor Bob Townsend, to try and demonstrate how big ships had become. That is Wells Cathedral sitting in the tanks of the largest tanker ever built, the Balamia, built in Saint-Nazaire in France, just to try and give people the impression of quite how big ships had become. Now, I can hear shouting at the screen again because, of course, we built big tankers. Generally speaking, our riverside investment was wide and narrow, and the rivers were too small, but we did some heroic things. This is heroic. This is Wallsend on the River Tyne, and famous photographs of very large crude carriers overhanging the terraced streets in Wallsend. Fantastic photographs. It was a heroic thing to do, to wrest these very large ships out of, well, want to launch them. I believe these were the biggest ships ever launched off a slipway, but to get them into the River Tyne in the first place was heroic. On the Upper Clyde, this is what they did in Scott Lithgow. They built them in two halves because the dock was only big enough for half a VLCC, and they were joined afloat. So technically, these were just astonishing things to do. Trouble is, I teach my students, it's not a technical challenge. Technical challenge is difficult, but we are not trying to build ships. We are trying to make money by building ships, and it's the economic challenge in shipbuilding that matters, and that's the really difficult bit. The technical challenge, I'm an engineer, we love technical challenges. Let me show you what that means. It took Swan Hunter up to 2 years to construct one ship. Market leader Mitsubishi Kawasaki was sending them out at 1 a month, 12 per year in their purpose-built factory. There was no way we could compete. No heroism needed in Kawasaki's tanker factory. And this was also, putting my nerd hat on as a ship person, not actually big by modern standards. A modern VLCC is 50% bigger than that, and we definitely couldn't have got that on the River Tyne. So, root cause number 4. Globalization and the end of empire. The end of empire also led to the demise of our colonial ship-owning companies that used to support us. So our home market disappeared. And if I were to, I won't dwell on it, but I'm sure this is well known to many people in the audience. If I put up, this is percentage of the world fleet under British flag between 1920 and 1990, it looks pretty much like shipbuilding through the 20th century. A gradual demise of our key client. But of course, warships are important as well. So it wasn't just that our home commercial market disappeared. I find this graph astonishing. This is output of number of vessels delivered to the Royal Navy between 1890 and 2010. And these two astonishing spikes in the 2 world wars. And of course, this is because I've got number of ships here and nothing to do with displacement or anything like that. So these spikes appear because we built a large number of wooden vessels, so motor torpedo boats, the coastal patrol vessels, Royal Naval Fleet Air Arm, and so on. So I'm more objective in looking at tons instead of actual numbers of ships built. But the naval market declined as well as the commercial shipbuilding market. The left-hand graph here is number of ships delivered per decade from the 1890s, and we can see that following 1950 we've been on a gradual declining trend from, in the 1950s, 35 ships a year to currently 4 or 5 ships a year is what the Royal Navy requires. And the left-hand graph partially explains that, and it's because each ship is now generally bigger and more capable. So if we look following 1940, this is the average displacement of ships per decade. We can see that the ships we build, a smaller number of them, but they are bigger and more capable. We need to sort of forget the left-hand side of that graph, which is the Edwardian dreadnoughts, which were very heavy for all sorts of reasons. So post-war, we've seen ships increasing, and we need fewer of them. That's the way our Navy has developed. So others caught up. Production methods changed, our capital investment was insufficient to compete in the New World Order, and globalization and the introduction of much larger ships wasn't suited to us, and our core markets disappeared, as well as our shipyards being too small. So back to the question, whatever happened to our shipbuilding industry? Well, everything changed. Our technological lead was gone by 1925. The technology and processes changed radically following World War II. The product changed radically following World War II, and the sum of those two meant that our investment was wrong. Our labour paradigms were wrong for the new way ships were done following World War II, and our shipyard sites were the wrong size and shapes. And we couple that to the risk. Shipbuilding is, certainly post-World War II, high investment, high risk. And the risk was beyond private capital to try and keep up with the way the industry had developed. And we add to that our core markets disappeared. So the answer to the question, none of these things helped. These were all symptoms, though. What happened to our shipbuilding industry was we were swamped by a tsunami of change that our industry wasn't suited for. And that's what closed a lot of our industry. And we should remember that it's not just us, that the significant part of the industry in Europe as a whole that existed up to the 1980s has now gone. So the end was inevitable. But back to the Iron Lady. What troubles me is that we possibly threw the baby out with the bathwater, in that we closed everything and we started to see shipbuilding as yesterday's industry and something we maybe don't want and don't need. Others in Europe have maintained a market presence and economic benefit, albeit from relatively small ships and specialist niches. And in those specialist niches, I include the big cruise ship builders in Italy and Germany. But we did possibly throw the baby out with the bathwater, and there were what we might call islands of excellence, successes that were probably worth keeping. And I've put up here just my islands of excellence from the River Wear, where I was a shipyard manager. We have the Palion shipyard there. Would have been great to take advantage of the huge boom in building offshore supply vessels in the 90s. A lot of you, I think, are going to recognize the ST-14 there, built in very large numbers, standard design that replaced the Liberty ship. They made profits for the shipyards that built them. They were a huge success. And then the bottom one is just a personal favorite of mine. That's the Stena Seawell. And that's another example of ships that, Stena love it. It's been through its 6th special survey. It's now 33 years old. It will go through its 7th special survey, and it is a fantastic product that we built. So we had an industry that was, to a large extent, moribund, but with areas of excellence that we perhaps should have cultivated more than we did. Now, to finish, that's all very interesting, but so what? I'm not a historian. I'm not an economist. Why am I doing messing about in other people's specialisms with history and economics? Well, I think we need to learn some very useful lessons from this story. We are sort of in a political wilderness because the way that blue line progressed over the 20th century, shipbuilding was trouble for a century. Over the course of the 20th century, shipbuilding progressed from political favour, those subsidies at the start of the century, to being a protracted political problem. The end of the 1980s saw we got rid of that problem politically. It saw a dramatic reduction in the level of political effort needed to deal with this most troublesome of sectors because we largely got rid of the sector. And it's left a legacy of reluctance to support an industry that was so difficult for so long. Why do I say it was politically the most difficult of industries? Well, I've put on this graph, quite complicated, but just stick with me for a moment. This is, per decade, the number of debates recorded in Hansard that relate to coal, iron, and shipbuilding, the 3 of our large heavy industries. And we see the light grey line, for example, is coal. And we see the number of debates kicking up in the 1920s around the general strike. around in the 40s and 50s, around the nationalisation of the coal industries, but then it disappears until it comes back again for the miners' strike in the 1980s. Steel was never particularly on the political agenda. But look at what happened to shipbuilding following World War II. Shipbuilding took up the most amount of political time and civil service time in the run-up to nationalisation and thereon during the closure of the industry. It was a political headache, a political nightmare, if we measure it by how much political time it took up. So my belief is that that legacy of such a difficult century may remain in our administration, manifested in support of a suspicion, if I may talk controversially, of the shipbuilding sector. We also have the legacy, which is a double-edged sword. The default position is now to view our industry in terms of its legacy. I say routinely, we always talk about resurrecting shipbuilding. We've been talking about that now for a century, no exaggeration. It's time we stop talking in those terms, because when we talk in those terms, one, we're talking about resurrection of an industry that ceased to exist after World War II, and we're talking about resurrection of an industry that was plagued with political problems throughout the 20th century. And we're talking about resurrection of the 3Ds, an industry that was dangerous and difficult to work in. So it makes no sense. Talking in the industry in this way is at best unhelpful, and at worst it engenders for me a presumption against the shipbuilding sector in our dealing with the sector. So for me, the legacy is an albatross around our necks. And I know, talking to colleagues in Japan, they see their own industry in very much the same terms. Because of this albatross, our default position is that we are unable to take an objective view of the sector. When we come up with a strategy, we come up with a strategy to take us back. We look in the rearview mirror and say, how can we get back there? And it stops us from thinking, okay, objectively where we are and how do we look forwards, identify where we're actually going. Why do we always look backwards? It doesn't help. It has no validity. It hinders the sector from successfully moving forward and addressing the opportunities that will present themselves to us. So how do I suggest we move forwards? Well, we need to understand what I've been talking about tonight, what happened in the 20th century, even if only to draw a line under it and then just consign it to history. It is no longer of relevance. It is time to move on and not forget this stuff. It's historically important, but it is not relevant to our industrial strategy in the UK. And eventually a generation will, probably 10 years from this now, will have passed since the 1980s. So the memory of the difficulties will eventually cease to exist in our administration. But that's still going to take time, and we've already lost several decades as other competitors have moved forwards. So that's my view, Alistair, and everybody. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this was rather disjointed in my control of the slides, but I hope the message came through.
John, if I might say, that was a fantastic summary of an extraordinary large, but less important subject. I'm so grateful to you. And I'm very sorry that you had technical problems. No doubt a Zoom representative sitting on the call would deny was their responsibility, but there we are. That's how it goes. We'll come again if we may. I'm not sure what there were in the way of questions. Perhaps Fiona, were there any questions that came through that you saw, if you can come online?
Not at the moment, Alistair. Not
at the moment. Okay, in which case, and I think that's probably what I perceived as well, which actually is a very good sign in many ways, because first of all, it keeps it less controversial, although I'm sure many people regard some of the things you said as possibly touching on the edge of controversy. But I think it actually is a measure of how incredibly broadly and successfully you covered this whole topic. I have got one thing I would just like to put your way, if I may, and I know we've had a series of discussions today, but back in September 17 was produced the National Shipbuilding Strategy. That was the government initiative to basically put out good news in terms of the construction of warships on the basis that this should stay within the UK for security reasons, if nothing else. to my mind, it's sort of left out in the cold anything that wasn't actually within that category. And for a time, I know that supply ships were actually graded as being possibly in the commercial sector. And as such, the commercial sector would be left for full worldwide and European competition. So there was a definite sort of division at that point. It's moved on now. I suggested to you earlier on that perhaps it doesn't seem to be working as well as was intended in September 17. And you sought very politely to disagree with that rather sweeping representation of mine. Perhaps you might like to address that in a second. The other one, if I may have two questions rather than two, is I pick up the wording of your letter on the 22nd of October to the Daily Telegraph, where you were coming round this this subject of the national shipbuilding strategy. And what you said, if I may quote, is, unless we start to look objectively at this industry and move away from viewing it in the context of the 20th century, as you've explained this evening, we will miss the opportunities that now present themselves, and will fail to use those opportunities to develop a viable and vibrant sector for the remainder of the 21st century. We are also missing an opportunity to address the real end goal in this strategy, which is to reduce the cost of warships. I'm not an economist, but reducing the cost of warships seems to me to be an extremely difficult target. That's my second point. My first point is, what really is the essence of those opportunities that offer themselves to a generation that won't remember the troubles up until the 80s in the industry?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, you're building there on, I just had a quick look at chat and there was a question in there, what does this mean in terms of our shipbuilding strategy? And someone else is asking, how does this align with autonomous shipping? So, well, first, shipbuilding, how does this fit with this strategy? Well, I think we need to take, the strategy included the lines, there has been a resurgence in shipbuilding. And that to me is not objective. There has not been a resurgence in shipbuilding in the UK yet. If we were to look objectively at data, we would see that we have an industry that is at the far end of maturity, by which I mean there are 2 or 3 suppliers building warships. How do we engender competition when competition doesn't exist, because the number of suppliers at that stage of maturity is so difficult? So, I mean, this is an example of we need to look objectively and stop looking backwards. The other thing that we have to deal with is that shipbuilding demand, it's not just for us, but in any sector of shipbuilding you look at, it is highly volatile. It is, no exaggeration, more volatile than any other sector of industry. And we try to deal with that by saying, how do we iron out the demand so we level out demand for warships? For me, that's the wrong way to look at it. The building strategy that has been pursued since World War II, the pursuit of volume, is not working. So almost exactly a year ago, I was presenting to an organization called the JCU. That's the senior executives of industries in Japan, Europe, China, Korea, United States. And I showed to them that if you look at commercial shipbuilding, volume goes up and down just as much as our warship building demand does. But we design our shipyards to address the peaks. So shipbuilding globally has had 7 good years in the past 40. It's as stark as that. So let's not think that those building ships in Korea are happy. Japan is really struggling. Korea is really struggling. My view is we need to stop thinking, how do we level the demand, or how do we stop doing what we mostly do, which is wish the demand away to a nice level strategy, and start putting some thinking into how do we construct a shipbuilding strategy that deals with the pattern of demand. And if we could do that, we cracked it, because nobody in the world so far has done that. So there is a technological opportunity there for us to think about that and stop trying to wish the problem away. The development of technology in terms of the products is another interesting one. There is a proposal at the moment to develop hydrogen-powered ships to utilize our short sea capabilities. So, you know, nowhere is more than 60 miles from the sea in the UK. We could take so much cargo off the roads by developing a hydrogen-powered short sea network to basically use our short sea shipping as a canal. Now, history shows us that those who get in early in developing such technologies, and somebody asked about autonomous ships, that would be included, they clean up. So I would say, I mean, we're not talking about big ships here, we're talking about small coastal ships. But look at what Australia did with fast ferries, with the fast cats. Australia was first in and they cleaned up. No one could get near them and they took that market. Those are the sort of opportunities that I would say we should be looking for. Now, how does this come up with cheaper warships? Well, in implementing the strategy, the strategy is aimed purely at warships, and it became apparent when it was being implemented that not including commercial shipbuilding was a mistake. Number one, because of the pattern of demand, we need commercial shipbuilders, as we did with the carriers, to provide blocks so we can build the ships that the Navy needs. But also, things like the FSS, we can use to help with that volatility of demand. So if you can do anything to help with the fluctuations in demand, then that will reduce the cost. And that's a really difficult value to capture, and I don't have a number. So I can say I firmly believe the trade unions did a fantastic piece of work to saying this is the value to Treasury of building those ships in terms of tax receipts and all sorts of other things that you can measure easily. What we never did is bottom out what is the value to the warship program of easing our volatility and the benefits that would be to warship construction. We've never bottomed that out. So, you know, what does this mean for our strategy looking forward? Well, number one, please can we stop talking about the past, because it doesn't help. Let's get rid of the albatross, take an objective view of where we are. We have this industry that's highly mature, that's facing this volatility, and I have no answers, by the way. You know, what I'm saying is this is the way we need to think about it. And if we think about it rightly, for sure there are opportunities, not just in innovative ships, but if we crack the new shipbuilding strategy, how we come up with economically building in such a volatile demand, it's not going to go away. The volatility in all sectors of shipbuilding will not go away, but we always design for volume, and we need to find a better way. So maybe I have ideas what elements there might be in that strategy, but I haven't got the strategy myself. But what I'm saying is we should be looking at it and trying to develop that strategy. And whoever comes up with that strategy, they will have opened up the next generation of shipyards, and they will be the market leader.
That is a fantastic response. Thank you very much for that. What strikes me is the tooling up, if I can call it that, of the industry. It must be a major challenge, not least, actually, as you were saying in your talk, the fact that the Hyundai heavies have set the protocol.
Well, as a student in 1983, I went to a conference that was titled Shipbuilding, High Risk, Low Return, ?
Yes.
Shipbuilding has always been high risk, low return, but we have this imperative that we need to build warships. And what is the way of doing that? And the strategy is, you know, in development for implementation and is proceeding. So what I'm not suggesting here is that we ditch the strategy, but what I'm suggesting is how do we build on that strategy to look at where we're going, particularly mapping where we are a little more correctly, and then look where we're going.
Sure. We're going to have another challenge as well, of course, that competitiveness is going to be mighty difficult in a world market, where that world market is also pointing downwards as well in terms of shipbuilding.
Well, quite frankly, very few people go into shipbuilding to make 30% return on your investment. You know, if you can make a return on your investment, it's a good year. And that is, you know, why is Korea invested so much in shipbuilding? Well, actually, the real value is in the supply chain. And the way their competitiveness works is that they've got the volume. So the big shipyards, 3 million tons of steel a year fabricated, just in, you know, more than we've ever done in this country as an entire nation. But every engine comes from the engine manufacturer, the Hyundai engine manufacturer next door. The contract, I mean, this is not only a technical problem. We need to get our contracts sorted that will enable us to use the new digital technology we use in design as effectively as we can in manufacturing. At the moment, our contracts won't let us. So what people don't see is that a big part of how does a Korean compete, the contract directs the makers list, so it directs all the purchases of the 70% of value that comes in from suppliers into the supply chain they've developed. So it's not about bashing steel. This is about coming up with an intelligent strategy of how we run an assembly industry. How do we, we almost need to go back to what was called Taylorism. Taylorism in the late 19th century was what Henry Ford looked at to develop mass production. The development, the core of Taylorism is simplification of the assembly process. And shipbuilders, of course, a fair amount of it is fabrication, but the big job is the assembly and the putting to work, the commissioning of the ship in the end.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
You're very
now,
welcome.
Fiona, have you found any more questions? If not, I think you've got something just to talk about. Hello. Now, is that Rod?
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you, Fiona.
Yes, a few questions have come in. Why does it take a relatively long time to design and build a warship?
Where do you
Should
start?
I not have asked you that one?
Well, the Royal Navy designs and builds ships that survive in combat. And, people argue, why do we spend so much time designing and building them? Well, I would put yourself in the position of someone under fire somewhere in the world. And, there is a perfectly good argument that we spend the right amount of time and money designing and building warships. Could we do it quicker? Quite probably. Do we want to do it quicker? Are there others in the world who do it quicker? Well, there are other people better qualified than I to answer that question. But, as with everything, that's not a simple question. And if the implication is we take too long and spend too much, there are certainly others who take longer and spend more.
Very good. Fiona, is there another one?
Yeah, there is. Sorry, I'm just looking through. I think you've. How important is government support to the future of the sector?
Oh, it's completely vital. And this is why I have spent so much time trying to get my head around this, because shipbuilding now and always has been heavily politically dependent for everybody.
Yeah.
Now, nobody is saying we need to go back to, and it's not just us, by the way. At the moment, I'm involved with putting together a case for World Trade Organization against certain organizations in the Far East on illegal subsidies. Nobody is saying we go back to the bad old days of the 1980s, where in the industry I was a manager in, every year we'd go with our hand out to government and said, we need a bit more money, please. We'll be better next year. And we go back the next year and say, well, things didn't go our way, but we'll be better next year. And to give you an idea of how bad it was, when subsidies started to be controlled by the EU, the limit was 35% of the ship's value was allowed to be given as a subsidy. It had got out of control. But there are other features of shipbuilding that mean that you have to have government assistance. One of them is with your financing, and this is almost common to every other shipbuilding nation in the world, that the finance industry is skeptical and does not like financing shipbuilding. So it takes us too long to put the finance package together, and government can help with that. We need help with R&D. So just as any sector needs help because of its idiosyncrasies, that's what we need. We absolutely do not need, I mean, we'd love it, I'm sure, but the government pouring money in. But what help is appropriate, we should get. And it's not defensive. We should not be looking and saying we need to be subsidized because another country is subsidized. Any successful shipbuilding nation has its subsidies to address specific problems with shipbuilding, and we should do the same in a positive matter that the industry needs some help because it is such a difficult sector. And why would we do that? Well, we have taken the decision, quite rightly, in most people's opinion, I'm sure, that we need to be able to build warships. And if we need to do that, then we need to find the way of an industry that will survive. And that industry will need some help. So we've got to get rid of this negative perception that I think has dogged us now because of the century of problems.
Well, I think that was fantastic. We've had a small handful of other questions, but I think probably the hour is moving on. So for those who very kindly put those questions up, and to you, Paul, will you forgive if perhaps I begin to draw us to a close? I think from the comments, some of the comments I've seen, this has been incredibly well received. food for thought, says the immediate past First Sea Lord. And that's good to get that sort of comment from the top of the Navy. And I think it's probably time to come on. Now, Fiona, would you like to talk about our next lecture?
Yes, I'll just take this opportunity to mention the next lecture, which will be held via Zoom on the 14th of December. The lecture is presented by John Johnson Allen, who is the liveryman of the Institute of Seamanship, and is entitled The Cruise of the Offshore, the Royal Tour of 1901, and is the Institute of Seamanship lecture. We will be sending details in due course. We hope we'll see you all on the 14th of December. Can I also take this opportunity to thank those of you who have made any donations, large or small? It's very much appreciated, and the Trust does thank you. And for those of you who would like to donate, there is the link at the bottom of this screen, or you can visit the website. Thank you.
Indeed. Well, it just remains with me to thank you, Paul, once again so much for coming on and doing this.
Thank you.
Heck of a lot of preparation, I know, in it, I can see. And hopefully you can turn it into a book if you haven't done so already.
Yeah.
It's a great summary of the whole story. And I must say, I've never seen the edges of the story until this evening, so well expressed. For all of you who have come on, thank you so much and stayed the course. It's been a long one, but there's been a lot of lean in the joint to be talked about. And we do hope we will see you next time. If you would like now, for those who want to remain, just to stay on, to turn on your videos and turn on and unmute yourselves. I will at this moment thank you all again for coming and declare the formal part of this evening over. Thank you.